and welcome to our live event here in LinkedIn. It's a true pleasure to having you with us, and we are very excited to launch our new event series today. Bayer is a company that is fundamentally driven by science and innovation. Our mission, health for all, hunger for none, is at the core of what we do every day. Through science, we seek solutions for some of the world's most pressing challenges in medicine and healthcare. Much like science takes us on a journey and kind of like path to develop, our what if series of events is intending to challenge conventional thinking and to imagine new possibilities. Over the coming weeks, we will host multiple sessions where we look into the future of healthcare, and we start today with a very exciting topic. Over the next 45 minutes, we will explore the question of what if cell and gene therapies redefine value for patients in healthcare? Cell and gene therapies are transformative scientifically because they are fundamentally changing how we understand and treat patients, but also how we look at the value. Today, we will discuss these aspects and what really define the value of therapies in the eyes of patients and healthcare, and how that could really change with the rise of cell and gene therapies. My name is Pia. I'm commercial lead cell and gene therapies at Bayer. I'm a natural scientist, passionate to make a difference for patients, and I've worked over the last years in the commercial space across regions and countries. Now I'm contributing my commercial expertise to our journey on how to bring the value of cell and gene therapies to patients. I'm the host and moderator today, and I'm very excited to introduce my two colleagues and experts for the session today, Ruth and Nicole. So Ruth is strategic program lead gene editing at Bayer and a cell and molecular biologist who has worked in the gene editing field since 2012, from technological development to CMC considerations, and is now driving strategic development and execution. Ruth, a big warm welcome to you. Our second speaker, Nicole, Global Lead Pricing and Contracting Cell and Gene Therapy at Bayer. Nicole is a pharmacist and scientist by heart who leverages her 15 years of market access and pricing experience to ensure patients get access to our CGTs. Also, a big warm welcome to you, Nicole. So before we get started, I would like to really encourage you to use our live chat we have and to kind of like ask the question which are most burning while we kind of embark on our topic of what if cell and gene therapies redefine value for patients in healthcare. It should be as interactive as it can get in such a virtual setting, so really use that kind of chat function. Now let's really start and jump in. What if cell and gene therapies redefine value for patients in healthcare? We really want to specifically dive into how it could change our understanding of value. But first, I would like to start, Ruth, maybe with you, to really clarify what are these therapies?
Yeah, absolutely, Pia. Happy to do so because cell and gene therapies, it's one term. It's often shortened into this acronym, just 3 letters, right? CGT, cell and gene therapies. But it really encompasses ways that these therapies can interact with the patient. So let's break it down. Glad to do so. If we start off with the term cell therapies, fundamentally, cell therapies can be described as using cells to treat disease. So that could be replacing degenerated cells or maybe even repurposing cells to have some sort of functionality within the human body. And a great example of this are the so-called CAR T cell therapies. And this is where a patient's own immune cells are repurposed with the right tools to specifically find and then fight the type of cancer that patient is suffering from. Now, gene therapies, on the other hand, that can be described as altering genetic material to treat disease. Again, a number of different types of gene therapies that exist out there. You could replace, inactivate, correct, or maybe even introduce genes into cells. And one really great example here is in the case of hemophilia. So the specific gene that's mutated in hemophilia, which is a severe bleeding disorder, this gene is known, and mutations in that gene result in the lack of a clotting protein, which is normal which is necessary for normal bleeding control in our body. And different types of gene therapy that could be used to treat hemophilia could be to simply deliver back to patients a functioning copy of that gene in order to restore the lost functionality, or maybe even use gene editing technologies to correct the specific mutation. What's common about cell and gene therapies, though, what binds all of these types of technologies and treatments together is the fact that they're developed to target that underlying root cause of a disease. So the gene is damaged, let's correct it. Or these cells are missing, let's give the cells back to the patient, let's replace them. And so really with an understanding of that underlying disease biology, cell and gene therapies aim to target the root cause of a disease. It's a fundamental transformation in the treatment paradigm, right? It's precision medicine instead of treating the symptoms. And that's really what could be game-changing for patients today.
Sounds amazing and so exciting, and it really shows what you explained on kind of the example of hemophilia, that it's a transformation how we treat diseases. So if you would kind of like really think of what makes these innovations possible to begin with.
Yeah, and these absolutely are transformative treatments in how we treat disease, and they are a reality today, right? We have nearly 100 cell and gene therapy products that are approved and on the market, and we're seeing signs of the difference they can make to patients' lives when it comes to personalization and precision medicine, as well as potential durability of treatment impact, potential long-lasting effects. But it's a really good question, right? What makes these innovations possible to begin with? And really it comes down to years of scientific research of brilliant minds coming together and relentlessly discussing the key questions in the field. Many of which actually begin with what if, right? The session title that we have today. And we've seen in the field over the past decades is just remarkable. We could go all the way back to the discovery of the DNA's double-strand helix structure, to the repurposing of adeno-associated viruses, which today a modified version of these viruses are used as delivery vehicles for gene therapy. And we could also touch upon the reprogramming of cells to create induced pluripotent stem cells, which are really a transformative type of cell therapy that's under clinical development today. And so you see we've got these, different sparks throughout history that propel the field forward. And a lot of these sparks, it's important to say, come from academic research, right? It's important that we acknowledge the fundamental importance of academic research that allows us, the three of us, to be here today talking about the transformative potential of cell and gene therapies for patients. But of course, translating those scientific breakthroughs into a reality of patients requires a huge, great effort of a number of different stakeholders, because there's many, many challenges and hurdles along the way. If you think about the development of the complex manufacturing processes, these are living things we want to administer to patients. It's a cell that needs to have some sort of functionality in the body. So you'll often hear in the manufacturing field the phrase, the process is the product, right? The manufacturing process defines what that final drug product is and how effectively and safely it works in the patient. We also need to understand that patient unmet medical need, especially when we're moving into the field of rare diseases, where there might not necessarily be a lot of groundwork knowledge that's there ahead of us. And then with that understanding, discuss how to design innovative clinical trials so that we can really assess whether our investigative therapy does address that unmet medical need that's been highlighted. Of course, you need brave patients who are willing to participate in these trials. And along with that comes the public, the patient, and the advocacy group acceptance of these new technologies. And then finally, of course, a developing regulatory landscape so that we can find new pathways to bring these technologies and these transformative medicines to the market. And so you can see all of that requires a lot of communication. It's a lot of collaboration between all of these stakeholders and parties that I mentioned, and many, many more beyond that too.
Thanks, Ruth, for kind of also touching across various aspects on kind of the journey. I think especially like that sentence you said and statement around like translating this cool science into like the medicine or the therapy for the patients. And you can probably even say not it takes a village to raise a child, but it takes a village to really bring these therapies to kind of like the patients. And so I want to kind of like switch gears a bit and go from the more scientific part and kind of like all these aspects around collaboration to really looking into the value. What are these therapies bringing to the patient? So if we look beyond the immediate health outcomes, what deeper value are these cell and gene therapies really bring to the patients in terms of well-being and quality of life? So Nicole, maybe you could elaborate on that a bit.
Thanks, Pia. And you can already sense the passion we also try to bring across for this new modality on the horizon. And for the patients, it's basically, for decades, many debilitating diseases have been labeled as intractable, which means that medicine could not provide an answer to that disease. Maybe there were a few medicines available who could treat the symptoms, but patients had to live with the condition and the disease would still progress. And those are very often also diseases which create a huge burden for the patients and their caretakers, being life-threatening or limiting. And with cell and gene therapies, we have a modality on the horizon which can revolutionize how we modify diseases. And maybe as a future dream, being even curative in the future. And we now having the first CGTs in the market, which are addressing diseases which had no treatment option before. And when we also look at other specifics of a cell or gene therapy, we look at a potential one-time administration. And in some cases, this might reduce the burden of an ongoing chronic treatment the patient has to take. It aims to improve the quality of life and well-being of a patient. And with that, there also comes an emotional relief for the patients and their caretakers. And I think this has not to be undermined.
I think there's one aspect you kind of like said, it's kind of like the passion behind that dream to potentially cure. And I think it is very important to say it's a dream currently and probably nothing which has kind of like been put into reality. But I think that is really kind of like to look also from that patient perspective. So if we now look into what are like the benefits on a broader scale, which probably are delivered to healthcare systems and the society at large. So how would you look at these, Nicole?
I mean, of course, you always would first look at the health outcomes. Is that a treatment option maybe in a disease area where there's not yet anything available? Or how good does that compare? So what's the added clinical benefit compared to what is out there already? How we traditionally treat a certain disease. But then beyond that, we also need to compare economic outcomes to understand are there potential cost savings also arising in the healthcare system? Is there less need for hospital visits, less need for surgical intervention, cost savings because we replace or complement current treatment options and really provide saving in the long run to the healthcare system in total? And I think another step we would also need to consider is the societal impact, because many of those CGTs have the opportunity to reduce our care burden, alleviating caretakers, nursing care, and getting patients back to work or into education, if we look at diseases where even kids are already affected.
Great. I think we touched upon a lot of very important aspects. I just want to remind everyone who's listening in, it's not just us kind of debating around these topics and kind of providing more insight. It's also you kind of shaping the discussion. So if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat, kind of send us your questions, maybe also some other kind of like highlights you have. Now, like going a bit more in the part of looking into which therapies and which conditions are really the ones which we could highlight if we think about cell therapies and the value they are created. So really looking into where are conditions where these therapies have created already value. Not sure like if Ruth or Nicole or both of you want to kind of like share a couple of insights here. Ruth, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, there we go. Of course, that had to happen at some point today, didn't it? Always good to be the first one. No, I can start with one example, maybe Pia, and then Nicole, feel free to add on with a couple of examples from your side. So I think one really interesting, use case where the value and the hope of cell and gene therapies could bring a lot of potential to patients is in the area of Huntington's disease, right? This is an absolutely devastating disorder with a fast progression of onset when it starts. And it's got such a strong genetic component that families and patients, they're almost sat there, if they've chosen to get the diagnosis, they're almost sat there waiting for the onset of symptoms to start, when they can see that their family before them, how much they suffered from the disease themselves. So it's a really, really terrible disorder. And the potential of cell therapies, gene therapies, these modern types of technologies and modalities to provide something completely transformative to these patients and completely change the course of their disease, I mean, that's something that can really motivate anyone, right? That's a dream to get behind and a hope to get behind to try and make a difference.
Great example, Ruth. But I feel we can also look at the more prevalent common diseases. I mean, I think over the last months, I realized that every one of us, or at least everyone we knows someone who has Parkinson's disease. And this is a disease where patients have uncontrollable movements. They have difficulties to walk, but also to eat or to sleep properly. And with the cell or gene therapy, and both modalities here offer an opportunity to tackle this disease, which is affecting quite a number of patients. So after Alzheimer's disease is the most second neurodegenerative disorder we're looking at. And CGT might offer a well-deserved retirement, and also enabling the grandfather or grandmother to keep up with the energy and curiosity of the grandchildren and really offer them a well-deserved retirement. And I think beyond that, rare disease, but also prevalent ones, there are a bunch of opportunities where we can close the gap of unmet need with that new modality. And if you might allow me, I also like always to share my personal experience, because my two boys have been born with severe hemophilia A, the example you were giving in your introduction, Ruth. And I would love them to see that they do not have to cope with IV injections every second or third morning in an already really squeezed morning routine, where you have to make sure that they get out in time. But then also my fear, basically every day, that I would get a call from school or daycare. I'm fearing that an accident has happened where the hemophilia disease itself is complicating the outcome of the accident itself. But then also thinking long-term, is it possible for them to take on every sport or travel or even studying abroad? So I think there are many fields and diseases where we could put relief to the patient and the caretakers and their families.
Thanks, Nicole, also for being open to share your personal experience. I think it really shows how kind of like it touches every part of the life and kind of what we also do day on day. I think now, like looking again more from like a strategic perspective on the entire topic, we have kind of like looked into a more general aspect, looked into the science around it, the value, and also kind of like what happens currently. But if we think more long term, so Ruth, from your scientific point of view, how do you envision the long-term impact of these therapies? Are we looking at potential cures or treatments in your eyes that are really transformative in one way or the other?
I love this question a lot. It's a really important question. It's a pretty big question, right? Because the term cure or curative potential, that's something that we hear a lot in the cell and gene therapy space. But it's a big word that we need to be quite careful about, because we really need to think, what does cure actually mean? I mean, if you look it up on Google, or if you just think about it a little bit more, right, it means to completely relieve an individual of the symptoms of a disease. So, the disease is gone and it won't come back. So how can you really know for certain with a new technology that's not been around for the lifetime of a patient about its curative potential? So it's really important that we discuss this, that we discuss the use of the word, and we bring some sort of realism, as well as, of course, a bit of optimism to this conversation. And looking at the cell and gene therapy field today, as I said before, with about 100 products already on the market, there are certain proof points, certain milestones, we can call them, that give the field that sense of cautious optimism. And I'll pick on just one example just to use that now. And that's the case of a little girl called Emily Whitehead. So at 6 years of age, she was faced with a life-threatening reoccurrence of a severe and particularly nasty form of cancer. The cancer had resisted 16 months of chemotherapy, right, which is a very, very harsh treatment, 16 months. And she'd relapsed a couple of times. And this is at 6 years of age. And so with, few other options, her parents decided to enroll her in a clinical trial of a new type of CAR T cell therapy. And this had never been tested in a child before. So, coming back to the point that was made earlier about the bravery of people to put themselves forward and to be involved in clinical trials, this is a fantastic example of that, the bravery of Emily and her parents and her family. And so that was in 2012 that Emily took part in this clinical trial and was administered with this CAR T cell therapy. And just last year in 2022, Emily celebrated being 10 years of cancer-free. I mean, what a turnaround that is from the life that she had beforehand. And so milestones like these, they provide a realistic perspective on what has been achieved so far. And they do reflect the scientific and therapeutic potential of these technologies, of these new types of modalities. But what is of key importance, of course, are long-term follow-up studies, right? Where clinical trial sponsors take the time to understand the full impact of a product over a long period of time. And in these studies, safety is a key measurable, of course, but in particular also the duration of the therapeutic effect, right? That could be measured over 10 to 15 years, as is the case that we have now with Emily. And a lot of the time, the value of cell and gene therapies is described about the durability of that therapeutic impact. One-time administration, long-term impact. But these long-term follow-up studies, clinical studies, are really critical, as well as preclinical studies, really crucial for us to understand truly what are the long-term effects of these therapies. And then with that knowledge, we can refine the therapeutic approaches, we can enhance the safety profiles, maybe even develop better diagnostic tools, gain a deeper understanding of that disease biology, and other things like identifying novel endpoints for evaluating these therapies. So yeah, it's a big question, Cure, right? We've got some fantastic proof points and some wonderful happy milestones already in the field where we see the impact of these therapies in patients' lives and in families' lives. But of course, we still need to do the groundwork. We still need to do a lot of preclinical and clinical research to understand the long-term effects of these therapies.
I think Emily, sorry, Nicole, please.
Sorry for interrupting here, but to add to Ruth's perspective, I mean, value also comes with the different perspectives. So what a physician might consider as a value of a new therapy might be kind of different to how a patient would view it, or the parents of a patient. And then again, also payers like insurance plans or sick funds have another perspective, because everyone comes with a different view on a new therapy. And I think the challenge for us is then also, or the opportunity for us, is to bring all those three views together. Because I also like to reference the restaurant situation. You should imagine the physician is ordering the food, the patient is eating it, but then the payer has to pay for the bill. And everyone comes with a different perspective. And I think we have now also the opportunity to bring all stakeholders along with what values this new modality offers.
Thanks, Nicole, for adding that on. I think it's great kind of to have a round perspective around it, but also I think the example of Emily gives me goosebumps and kind of really shows what potential kind of these therapies have. I just want to quickly give you an update. Like, we really have already 2,000 video views. We have more than 20 countries who are listening in. So there is a high interest in the topic. People from Brazil, Netherlands, India, Algeria, Argentina, Italy, Romania, just to name a couple of these ones. And there is already a question. I think it's more to Ruth. And it is, could you maybe explain an example of an ongoing innovative clinical trial and CGT? So maybe just high level to kind of like answer that question from the audience.
Yeah, maybe I'll even take it more to the landscape perspective of cell and gene therapies instead of diving into one or two examples. There are currently thousands of clinical trials ongoing for cell and gene therapies based on the latest numbers that were published just about a month ago. Thousands of clinical trials ongoing, and they are testing these different types of technologies and modalities in a vast array of different indications. So oncology is a big area of research. Neurodegenerative disorders are a big area of research, Parkinson's in particular, to take the example Nicole spoke about earlier, as well as rare genetic disorders and neuromuscular disorders, where technology is more on the gene therapy as well as the gene editing side of the spectrum are being used to maybe even correct that point mutation that's causing a disease, or to fix that genetic root cause that's driving a disease. So it's really a vast field. There's a number of different use cases, and I suppose the similarity in all of that is it's about applying the right technology to the right patient population to tackle that underlying root cause that drives a disease. So it's the science that's driving where the potential of these therapies are.
Thanks, Ruth, for kind of taking the question. I think looking now into having all these cool science, trying to bring them kind of through the patients, I think we should never forget that there is also a healthcare system out there which probably hasn't kind of like transformed or changed in the same way than the innovation which is driven in the labs and kind of like across the ecosystem. So Nicole, if you kind of look into the unique nature of the cell and gene therapies, how are you kind of like seeing the healthcare system transformation to really bring these therapies to patients? And do you really think that the systems are already ready to embrace these innovations?
Frankly, I must say not yet. I mean, it's historically driven. When we look at the processes in our healthcare systems, I mean, they have been developed alongside how medicine has developed. Patients approached the physician with chronic conditions, and then they were given medicine on an ongoing basis to address the underlying or to address the symptoms of the disease. And then the patients would accrue the benefit over time, and the payers pays for the drug as they are consumed. And that is creating the issue now with a one-time administration and a long-term benefit. Current CGTs are paving the way into the systems. They started the transformation, but the systems are recognizing that the current structures are not yet fit for purpose to fully embrace CGTs. And as always, each advancement has its own unique operational and financial challenges. Those systems must now start to accommodate. And what is potentially a benefit from a patient's perspective, this one-time administration, and the long-term benefit, it's really a challenge for access. It's generally not possible to create the complete evidence of a full benefit of a cell or gene therapy in a clinical trial setting. This creates uncertainty around what is actually the full value a cell or gene therapy might bring forward to a patient, relating to its magnitude of effect, but also to its duration at the time of access evaluation. So as Ruth said, afterwards, we also need to continue to monitor how's the performance of a certain CGT, and the patient has to be part of that journey alongside. And while regulatory authorities are evolving their processes, they're engaging in collaborative discussions, how to accelerate development timelines to get those new modalities to the patients in need, while critically ensuring the safety on that road. This is not yet matching how the market access decisions are taken thereafter. And I must even say it's contradicting to what a payer would need to have to fully judge on, is this really adding value to the treatment standard we're currently having in the system? And how does that impact my healthcare budget I need to operate with? And provocatively, I must say, we must ask ourselves collectively, how much are we willing to deal with the unknown? And that we balance the uncertainty with fast access for patients. And are we ready to embrace that innovation and start in believing in certain value claims? And in return, we would then only pay for the value the CGT has then delivered in the end. So these are complex topics, and it's not just the three of us, but it's a huge team beyond. And this is why we all together need to talk about the transformation which is starting and which is needed to achieve a good access to patients to these new therapies for better health outcomes, for better value recognition, and for better collaboration in the end.
So just looking at a couple of the aspects you touched upon, I think there's a lot in which needs to still kind of figure out collectively as an ecosystem in the industry. You touched upon the point of collaboration, really kind of working together on it. I would like to now take what you said is probably like a challenge or a hurdle and put it to Ruth and say, Ruth, if you look from like the scientific advancements, how could they really help to overcome some of these challenges and maybe even promote faster and more widespread access?
Well, I could talk for a long time about scientific advancements, but I suppose I'll just touch upon a couple here, maybe a few key examples. One key area that's discussed a lot right now in the area of gene therapies is the concept of delivery. So the delivery vehicle that's used to deliver either the gene or the gene editing components to the right cells and tissues in the human body. So that you then have expression of that functional gene leading to expression of functional protein in the right cells and tissues to have a therapeutic effect for the patient. And enhanced delivery technologies is absolutely an area where we could see a lot more innovation potentially coming in the next years that could, maybe lead to more effective gene therapies. It could lead to more safe gene therapies, maybe even more cost effective, right? And overall, with all of that, thinking about the enhanced safety profiles that we could have for patients, that may increase the patient access to these types of gene therapies, increase the number of patients that would be in scope for receiving one of these types of gene therapies. And then maybe another example, more on the regulatory side of things, right? Engaging with regulatory agencies early on in the development pathway, especially as Nicole pointed out, because expedited review and accelerated review is something that can be sought for in this field of cell and gene therapies, where you're trying to develop medications for indications of a really high unmet medical need. This, of course, can sometimes shorten the time to market and improve, therefore, that timely access to bring these therapies to patients who, quite frankly, in many cases, cannot wait, right? So that's another example, early discussions with the regulatory authorities. And then if we think of the clinical trial setting and the way that we interact with patients and design clinical trials with patients in mind, advances in remote monitoring and digital health technologies could potentially reduce the need for frequent hospital visits. It could reduce that burden on patients, that they don't necessarily need to come to the hospitals and the treatment centers as regularly as in the past. And that, of course, as you could imagine, would improve the accessibility of participating in clinical trials and beyond for patients. So I think for all of those examples, plus many more that I'm sure many people could think up, really what's key is building these partnerships amongst these different stakeholders, because whether it comes to developing a new delivery technology or thinking up new regulatory pathways or advances in digital tools to help innovative clinical trial design, no one person or one company or organization can do that on their own. All of that is around breaking down silos, breaking down barriers, and having conversations with all of the key stakeholders around the table to really ultimately share that risk, but also that reward of cell and gene therapy development, and to create those frameworks that allow for that value and that reimbursement of these therapies appropriately.
Ruth, you touched upon two aspects I really want to kind of like take now again. The one was the accessibility of these therapies, and the second one, collaboration partnership. So there's also a lot of questions from the audience around kind of accessibility and access to these medicines. So maybe Nicole, could you elaborate a bit around like your thoughts on making sure we can make the therapies accessible to everyone who needs them?
Frankly, this comes down to an element we need in all relationships, which is open and honest communication. So we have to make sure that we get all the stakeholders at one table. And with that, I mean regulators, payers, the providers, the patients, to understand what drives the value of a new therapy in a given disease and how can that feed into the trial design so that everyone understands I'm getting the most of this out of this new therapy. And CGT will also likely change infrastructures. So when we think about a patient having the diagnosis, then receiving the treatment, and then the altered need for follow-up, this will change the management of the patient in the system. It will require new regulations, new policies, but also it will free up potential resources where then physicians could spend their time with patients of other chronic diseases where like the traditional treatment approaches might be sufficient. And this early engagement, and sometimes we might ask ourselves, why do we want to engage so early? We are still a few years out, so we start already talking now with the stakeholders, although we do not yet have a specific asset, but rather on an agnostic level. But we need to talk to peers and regulators and policymakers to understand how would they determine the funding, the regulation behind the access to these therapies, but also listen to their pain points. Because if there are system changes required, we need to address this in the best all together and jointly, because these will take time. You cannot change a law from one day to another if it's as simple as accounting rules. Just to give one example. And last year, a Spanish payer even told me, and this is also, again, future aspiration, maybe we should also stop thinking about we are selling drugs and the payers would buy the drugs and make this accessible to the patients. Maybe we should find a joint way together to think about what are the disease areas of highest unmet need for our society and have a joint investment and figure out how we improve healthcare for society from a holistic point of view. And I would always love to have this call for action, like, come on, let's break up our silos and join forces as a team. I mean, we need to listen to each other. We need to learn together what solutions would work best to make these new therapies accessible for patients. Maybe in some instances we would fail, but we would always learn how to make that happen in the end and find the best solution. And we need to adapt our processes, ideally jointly together, and have patients and physicians. So not just a bilateral relationship between payers and manufacturers, but really bring patients and physicians along, because they are the ones who tell us in the end, what's the value of a CGT? How well do they do on the therapy? What's the long-term efficacy and value they're receiving out of this, and having a better health outcome, and frankly, also to give back hope to the other patients who need them.
Ruth, maybe one last statement to that entire topic around like partnering, collaboration, early engagement from your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could give a couple of other examples where collaboration and partnership is key for this field. Having, been a scientist that worked in academia and now works in industry, something that I really love to see, and I see it more and more these days, luckily, is this collaboration, this public-private partnership collaboration between scientists from different institutions, from academia, from pharmaceutical companies, and from biotech, because this fundamental research that's necessary, and as I said at the beginning, a lot of which does come out of academic labs, this is necessary for the whole field to drive the innovation and to accelerate the discovery of new technologies, the discovery of new targets of disease. Again, we need to understand that underlying disease biology to be able to tackle the root cause that drives a disease. So it's the discovery of new technologies, it's the understanding of disease biology and new target discovery, as well as then the development, the translation of these technologies into turning them not into a technology, but into a therapy that could transform a patient's life, right? These public-private partnerships and bringing together scientific minds around the table are just a really beautiful example of how the field can be accelerated. And maybe one other example, again, come into this topic of regulatory authorities, because I mean, we've touched upon it multiple times already, but this really is an area where there's beautiful collaboration and open communication between the regulatory authorities and clinical trial sponsors, the companies, and with patients and their advocacy groups, so that we can design the right clinical trials, so that we understand that patient unmet need, and that we can really assess jointly together whether the data we're seeing gives us confidence in the safety and the efficacy of these new modalities. And so those conversations that are happening, a lot of which, you know, are driven by regulatory authorities, by companies, by patient advocacy groups. These are some great examples of how the field can be accelerated.
Great. So Ruth, I think there's one question or a couple of questions which are probably like something for you to take up and going in the direction of, what about cell and gene therapies for cancer? And the other one is going in a similar direction because it looks into if you could speak about immunotherapy. So maybe touch upon the cancer or the immunotherapy first.
Yeah, sure. Because I think we've mentioned cancer a couple of times already, right? With the example of Emily Whitehead, and of the thousands of clinical trials that are ongoing, a number of them are tackling different forms of metastatic and non-metastatic cancer. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take a bit of a scientific approach to this. The typical type of cell therapies that are on the market today in the field of oncology for cancer, it's a type of cell therapy where the patient's own immune cells are removed from their body and then re-engineered to be able to specifically and in a targeted manner find and then fight that cancer that the patient's suffering from. So it's a beautiful example of a type of precision medicine, designing a therapy for the patient themselves. And there's a couple of examples of these types of CAR T cell therapies already on the market today, but there's a lot of innovation happening in the field to improve upon this and to do even better, to make them more safer and more efficacious. One example is, instead of needing to take the cells from the patient, how about that starting material to make the CAR T cell therapies comes off the shelf, so to say, so from a donor, where then you can manufacture these cells at large scale. You can freeze them down at large scale. You would have manufacturing advantages there, and you would shorten that manufacturing timeline, and you would decrease the number of interventions that that patient would need to go through before they would get that cell therapy at the end. So that's one example, and there's a number of clinical trials currently running testing that approach. So not starting with the patient's own cells, but donor cells. And then one final area that is really very early, but very excitement, and there's quite a lot of early stage preclinical activities happening at the moment, is the idea of why do we even need to repurpose the patient's immune cells outside of the body? How about we try and do that inside the patient in the first place, to totally change the way that we treat cancer? And this would be an idea of developing certain delivery technologies that can then specifically enter the patient's own immune cells, deliver that cargo that the immune cells need to be able to recognize and target and fight the cancer. And so that's, you know, a next wave of innovation in the field where we're totally changing how we would interact with the patients. And we're hopefully going to, you know, improve the efficacy and the safety of these therapies, but also reduce the burden on the patients by changing the way we interact with them.
Great. And we are already close to the end of the session, so I think time flies when you kind of have fun. I just wanted to kind of like bring everything together, and if you reflect on the scientific innovations, but also the system shifts which are currently underway, do you both feel we are prepared to embrace kind of and maximize the value of cell and gene therapies, both for patients and healthcare? And if so, what gives you confidence to believe in it? Ruth, you're smiling.
Shall I start, Nicole, then?
Go first, Ruth.
It's a big question, right? One that requires a bit of thinking. So are we, prepared? Are we ready? Short answer, I could say, yeah, I think so, right? But maybe a slightly longer answer, we probably need to break that down into a few different parameters, right? What does it mean to be prepared to embrace this journey? Are we at the table? Yes, I would say so. Bayer as an organization, you can read in the news, we've made significant steps in the field of cell and gene therapies, and we're pretty committed to that, right? Are we willing to have conversations with all of those different stakeholders that Nicole and I have mentioned today? Yes, it's very clear that we can't do this on our own. We need to collaborate and we need to communicate with all of these experts and all of these important stakeholders and key people around the table. And then are we willing to put the effort in to drive forward? Because there's a lot we know today. There's some fantastic proof points, clinical milestones that we can see in the field, but there's also a lot we still don't know. And there's a lot of innovation that still needs to come to shape not only the science, but the whole healthcare systems to really bring these to the market and bring these to patients. And I would say, yeah, we're ready to do that. We're ready to put in the legwork. We're thinking about a lot of these questions that we've discussed today with all of you guys. And there's many more questions we're discussing internally as well to make sure that we're prepared, that when we have the belief in a therapy that we think it can make a difference, we're prepared to do what it takes to really accelerate that through clinical development and bring it to the market in a successful manner. And Nicole, how about your thoughts?
I can only echo what you have just summarized, Ruth. And I think we are also ready because we recognize the challenges and the system and realize we need to start talking to the stakeholders much earlier than for the traditional medicines. And I think we're ready and we're open. Plus, if I look into our company and if I look to my closest colleagues like you both, I see the passion. I see the passion that we look and try to understand what does it mean for a patient to live with this or that disease? Yeah. And where can we make a difference? And then also thinking, is CGT appropriate? And if yes, we really try to drive that forward with science, with working with the regulators, with reaching out to the payers and really offer them. Sometimes I say this is now the opportunity. We tried so often, but really we need to come together, be adults in a room and honestly talk about, okay, what are the pain points? But let's transform the healthcare systems to make that a reality. Maybe I can close with a quote from Dr. Stelios Kumpuropoulos, a member of the European Parliament. He said, cell and gene therapies present tremendous hope for patients with serious diseases in the EU. But if we don't modernize health systems to provide access, hope is all we will have. And I think many of our payers also realize that. And I think we now have a chance to really jointly work together and find a solution for cost-constrained healthcare systems, but to make that happen and have patients accessible.
Nice closing words from both of you. So I would like to thank Ruth and Nicole for your time, your perspective, and the insights today. It was really fun being with you here and explore how cell and gene therapies could redefine the value for patients in healthcare. I really want to give a big thank you to the audience for all your personal stories, the interest and the questions. There's one brief kind of example I want to read out, which comes from Dominic Strauss, who said, thanks, Ruth, for highlighting Huntington's disease. This is one hit close to home for my family. I stumbled upon this discussion. I'm so glad I joined. So I think that is a really, really nice feedback from you. We hope that the session was insightful for you. You probably took something away. Maybe it sparked excitement about the future of healthcare. And we really hope to see you back soon. There have been also a lot of questions around cancer therapies. So there will be also a session around that. Our next session will be on Tuesday, November 14th. So next week. So second session, there we will shift gears and look at what medicine healthcare could look like if we all had digital twins. So please kind of like check out the chat. We will share the link and stay tuned for the sessions we have. Thanks so much for your time and goodbye.